Hi, I'm Patty Stallings, president of the Culver Historical Society, and we welcome all of you here. And it's a beautiful day to be in a cemetery. It's kind of overcast and a little dreary, and I think we're getting the right feeling here. But this is a celebration of life here, and it's not enough. Hello. Oh, hello. I'm starting over. It's a celebration of life of some very interesting, historically and wonderful people that you're going to meet today. And we thank you all for coming out, and we hope that you'll join the Historical Society. And we're always in the paper, so we'll be starting again next year. And this is our last presentation this year, function. But the board keeps working, and please let us know if you have ideas. Last year, people came forward, and we got some wonderful ideas for this year. So you can let me know, or just text or call the Historical Society. So thank you all for coming, and I'd like to introduce, everyone knows him, but Jeff Kenny, and he is going to be our MC today.
All right. See if I can do this. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Welcome. I'll get out of the way here and let our presenters begin here in just a moment. Again, this is the Historical Society of Culver's last summer program, as Patty said. Also, thanks to those with the Culver Union Township Public Library who helped make this possible, and many volunteers. So just be sure to look in your program for the names of our volunteers and our presenters. And so generally speaking, we're going to go in alphabetical order with our program today. And that means we will begin with taps, of course. Sorry, thank you for that. Let's begin. Let's kick the event off with the playing of taps.
I can't stand it. I'm sorry.
Our thanks to Jack Wu, Culver Military Academy class of 2024, for playing taps for us today. Is there anyone present besides the presenter who is a member of the Harold Bryant family of Culver? If so, please stand. I want to acknowledge family members. Okay. So our first decedent is Harold Bryant, a World War II participant from Culver.
Thank you. If I could just be out of character for just a second, I would have been surprised if there was a family member here, because Harold Bryant was my great uncle, so I am portraying a family member today. I was born in Argos in 1925, the fourth of 5 children to my parents Wesley and Chloe Bryant. My parents lost their farm during the Depression, and they moved to 809 Obispo Street in Culver in 1933. I enrolled in Culver schools while my older siblings found jobs and got married. I loved driving and working on tractors. My oldest brother Henry had a clothing company he retooled to make rubber raincoats and boots during the war at Kingsford Heights. My brother Herberdine, and we called him Beanie, enlisted in the Army right after Pearl Harbor. My little brother Hilton would later serve in the Korean War. Am I? Okay, sorry. And then well, now I hear myself. So, and then my sister and her husband, Alice and Jack Garner, they worked for the Kingsbury Ordnance Plant. And they were joined there by my father, and later I joined them after I graduated from Culver Schools. Jack was given rations, gas rations, to drive people and carpool people from Culver up to the ordnance plant to work. At 18, I was ordered into pre-induction and a physical in February 1944, and then was drafted in March of the same year, and ordered to report by way of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which I took from Plymouth. I visited my Culver home one last time in August of 1944 on furlough. After 17 weeks of training at Fort Blanding and Fort Maxey in Texas, I was deployed to Europe, and by November was transported to Belgium. I celebrated my 19th birthday there on November 14th, 1944, the day before I wrote my last letter home. Hitler's army had been in retreat since our forces landed in Normandy, but he made one last-ditch effort through the dense area of the Ardennes, which is a forested area in Belgium and Luxembourg. The way the Axis forces kind of were composed, it formed a bulge in the area, hence the Battle of the Bulge, the name, the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive began on December 16, 1944, and was successful because Allied commanders did not expect Hitler to move through that terrain. But his forces were well equipped and well trained to fight in that area, regardless of the blanket of snow. We were hunkered down in our foxholes on Christmas Eve. All seemed quiet. About midnight, a buddy and I heard other troops singing Christmas carols in another foxhole, and it reminded me so much of home and my family. So we crawled over to join them. It was at that time that a German shell hit the foxhole that we were in. Me and two other troops were killed instantly. The guy who survived lost his mind. Had it not been for a friend I met from Fort Wayne named Ewing Laird, who just happened to meet my dad's brother after the war in 1946, my family would have never heard this story. The Secretary of War sent a telegram to my parents on January 7, 1945, expressing his deep regret that I was killed in action. They first buried me at Henry Chapelle. That was an American cemetery in Belgium. Then in January of 1948, I was brought back to the States, sent by rail to the depot at Hibbard, where an American Legion escort from Culver met me and brought me back. My family held services on January 15th at the church we attended, the Culver EUB church just up the road, and then I was buried here, where I was joined by my mother in 1950 and my father in 1960. And I'm over there.
Thank you to Kurt Garner. And incidentally, just a note on the event, if you've attended before, we had, as you know, and I think you've all figured out, we had small groups walking around to each gravesite. Clearly we're not doing that this year. We thought that would be easier for all of you. But at the end of the program, everyone's welcome. We have the graves marked, and our volunteers will help guide you to each grave so that you can, if you'd like to visit each grave, you may. Our next decedent is Margaret Bernhard Carter.
Good for you. Oh, hello. You caught me while I was cleaning. But welcome. I'm Margaret Bernhard, and I was born in Shatad, Hungary. Now, Shatad was a German settlement, and about everybody there was German. So my parents were German, my grandparents were German, and I had two younger sisters. Now, when I was about 6 years old, we decided to come to America. And we landed in Ellis Island. saw things that I'd never seen before. One of them was, they called it a banana, and they put the peeling off of it, and they ate the cob. We had relatives in Chicago, so we headed that way. And my father ended up as a kind of a groundskeeper for a doctor at his house. And the house was on a lake. And the Indians would walk across our yard, and they couldn't get the gate open, so we girls had to open the gate. Now, there was a railroad track close to it and a big trestle bridge. And in the morning, my dad would take us across the trestle bridge to school, and then he would pick us up in the afternoon. Now, to make sure there was no trains coming, my mother would go out, and if it was clear, would wave a big white cloth to say, all clear. Well, one time we were partway across that bridge, and we hear a train coming behind us. My dad grabbed us up and ran across that bridge. And then in the winter, they did something down on the lake. They cut big chunks of ice. We didn't know what they were doing, so we went down along the shoreline to see what it was good, what they were doing. And my littlest sister stepped on a cake of floating ice. Fortunately, Mother had a hold of her hand and pulled her out. Well, I think that was about the time that my dad decided we ought to leave the doctor. So I can remember him sitting there with a paper looking for want ads, and he found one that said, Hibbard for sale, a farm for sale in Hibbard, Indiana. So he bought a team of horses in Chicago and a wagon, loaded them on the train, and brought them to Hibbard. So people directed us down to the farm, and we could see the house in back, and we could see there was a long lane, but we didn't see there was a little ditch. And things were kind of overgrown, and the horses fell in the ditch. Well, Dad got them out and they were all right, but that was scary. And there was a huckleberry marsh on the farm, and Dad put us we girls in charge of the huckleberries. And people would pay us 10 cents a quart to pick them, and if they didn't have the money, they would give us a third of what we picked. Now, the good thing about being in Hibbard was we girls could walk ourselves to school. And it was only grade school. So when we got to high school, we had to come into Culver. And so I had a room with an older couple, and I would do chores around the house to help pay for my board and keep. And on the weekend, I'd go back out to the farm. Well, I graduated from Culver High School, and then I went to Angola to college to learn how to be a teacher. And I taught at several different country schools. And one of them was a little village called Paxon. And I met a nice gentleman, and we fell in love and got married and had a little girl. And I lived in the house with him on his farm with his mother and his sister. And one day I needed help with something, and his name was Ray, so I had to hunt for Ray. Finally found him in the brooder house with the baby chickens. He was biting their heads off. Oh. Yes, and then his sister was gone, and his mother was gone, and I was getting ready to wash some clothes and found a piece of paper in one of his pockets that said, Margaret and the baby are next. I was petrified. So I called my sister to come and get us. And I knew if he saw me riding in the car, he would take me out and kill me right there. So I laid on the floor in the back seat, and they took us back to the farm. Well, we called the sheriff from there, and my dad and I went with the sheriff back to the Ray's farm. And I could say, okay, his sister is buried there by the steps to the back door. His mother is buried in the hen house. He was sentenced to life in prison. So my little girl and I lived in the farmhouse for quite a few years. And then there was an opening for a teacher in Culver, and I applied and got the job. Well, the little girl and I moved back into town, and we were like a block from the main street, all of the stores, the bank, the library, and 2 churches. And on nice days, I could walk to school. Wonderful thing. Oh, and we knew all of our neighbors around and visited with one. And right across the street was a nice gentleman that was a widow. And he used to start taking us to places around. And then one day he asked me to marry him. And that's when I became Mrs. Ernest Carter. And then tragedy shook our little family. And my daughter's husband was a soldier and was fighting in the war, and he got killed. Yeah, tragedy, so sad. But I was always interested in other countries around the world. So one summer, I signed up for an extensive tour. Got to ride a live camel, and we went to Paris. Oh, we went to a stage show, and I was so embarrassed. Those girls hardly had any clothes on. And I looked all around, and everybody else was watching, so I did too. But you know, I got a lot of pleasure, a lot of enjoyment out of teaching. And I made up a rule or a motive, a goal for myself. I wanted to be a teacher for 50 years.
Dr. Rag.
Yes, you need those.
Is anyone in the audience a member of Margaret Carter's family? Would we stand so we can acknowledge you?
Good, stand.
If you,
If I can.
it's convenient. Thank you, Marilyn Kelly. Our next decedent is Mr. John R. Mars.
Obviously, I am not related to John R. Mars. John R. Mars, born John R. Marsellini. He was born January 20th, 1919, and died August 26, 2011. His marker is back over in the quadrant close to the road. John was the 10th superintendent of the Culver Academies from 1976 to 1981, following some very turbulent years from 1967 to 1975 at the Academy. He was preceded in death by his wife Phyllis in October 2007. Surviving John are his two sons, Anthony Tony Mars, and his wife Kim, and Dr. Pete Mars, and his wife Brianne. They could not be here today for this presentation. John was a graduate of Brown University. While at Brown, he had an outstanding baseball career. In 1940, he had a batting average of .408 with 5 home runs, and over his 3 years playing at Brown, he compiled a .308 batting average and played first base for the Brown Bears. He was president of his class for 4 years, and as a senior, was also president of the Browns Cimmerian Club. This was a group of outstanding men in scholarship, character, and prominent college life. The Cimmerian Club was organized originally in 1893 as a senior society. Its members chose the name of the club from the Latin word for lobster. When John graduated from Brown in 1941, he immediately joined the Culver Military Academy as a Spanish and French instructor. In 1943, he briefly left the academy to serve his country during World War II. Before joining the United States Army 10th Armored Division, he was, as I said earlier, he was originally born John Marcellini, but he changed his name to John Mars because of its similarity to Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who founded and led the National Fascist Party from 1919 to 1943. Then in 1944, he returned to the academy and resumed his duties. During his more than 40 years of service to the academies, he touched an unbelievable number of lives. I'm proud to be one of those people he touched, as I will describe in a moment. From 1941 to 1950, he taught Spanish, German, and English while being an assistant coach, football coach. Then in 1950, while teaching, he became the assistant counselor for Battery B, the unit I was in when I attended the academy. He coached baseball, and in 1951 and 1960 was the counselor from 1951 to 1960, he was the counselor of Battery B while still teaching Spanish. In 1960, he became the assistant dean in the academic office until 1964. Then in 64, John became the chairman of the foreign language department and master instructor until 1970, when he was promoted to executive assistant of the dean of the academy and acting superintendent. John continued in those capacities until July 26, 1976, when he was appointed the 10th superintendent of the Culver Academies. Over his 40 years, he was also heavily involved in the Culver Summer Schools program. Following the end of the Vietnam War, Culver was dealing with great internal struggle and dissent. It was his leadership that the students, alumni, parents, faculty, and staff all became more proud of Culver. In 1981, a feature story in the Culver alumnus, Dean Alexander Nagy, called him, and I quote, "the right man in the right place at the right time," end quote. John was, as Dean Nagy put it, and I quote again, "a healing remedy in a school for almost a decade to find a renewed sense of identity and direction." Throughout his tenure, he was at that parade. John was walking through can't make the trips anymore, so we want to sell our house. He said, "I've only had one offer." And I said, "Okay." He said, "Well, that offer was from a person who is very well connected with the Culver Educational Foundation. It lives, maybe about 200 feet away." And I said, "Well, why don't you take it?" He said, "Well, he wants to buy my house, level it, and put a tennis court up." He said, "I'm not selling that to him for anything." And I said, well, I'm interested. I said, I got to come back in 30 days to put my son in woodcraft camp. I said, why don't you get the house appraised? We'll talk when I come back. In June, I came back, put my son in woodcraft camp, sat down with John and Phyllis, and we agreed on a price. And I said, I'll be back in August to pick my son up, because I live in Texas at the time. I'll come back in August and pick my son up, and I'll bring the cashier's checks at that time. In August, I came back, picked my son up, we signed the papers, and that's how I lived on North Shore Lane, Martini Lane, in John Mars's house. And I did that until 2003. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. And as alluded to, I don't think there are any family members of John Mars present, but if so, let us know. I don't think so. So our next decedent, our portrayer, Kathy Thomas, could not be here today, so with apologies. Pearl Klein Onesti, her biography is at her grave, so after the program, we'll point out where that is, and you can read her story, so we apologize for that. So our next decedent is David Witted, and I don't believe there are any family members present of David Witted. So, without further ado.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David S. Witted, and I mostly worked over there at the academy. I came here from Rockville down in Park County in 1901. My younger brother Luther worked here at the school as well. I graduated from high school in Rockville, and I spent 1 year in business college in Terre Haute. But when I was 20, it seemed as though a steady job would be a very good idea. And we had heard stories about a black community developing up north here in Culver. Now, there were quite a few black folks living in the town of Culver when I came, probably 45 or 50, which might have been about 1 in every 10 people. Well, that all started with people who came with Colonel Fleet from Missouri Military Academy in 1896. That school was in Mexico, Missouri, and for a number of years, other people from Mexico followed along. Mr. George Rollins, who founded our AME church, came from Mexico a year or two after Colonel Fleet, and Roy and Lily Scott, and Roy Scott was known to everybody as Sheep, were married in Mexico, and I didn't move here until a year afterwards. Though as far as that goes, when I married my Zena in 1905, we had ceremony back home in Park County rather than here. My family and Zena were both from North Carolina, and in fact my older brother Virgil was born down there in 1869 before the folks decided to come north. They had both been back in they were both born back in slavery days in the 1840s. My father's name was Anderson, which was Luther's middle name as well. And I understand that there are still all sorts of Andersons and Witteds down in our old home county. Zena and I had 2 boys, Palmer Dean in 1907. I should call him Palmer Dean Witted Sr., since he and his wife Virginia have given us a grandson of the same name, who's already so handsome he'll probably grow up to be a movie star, as well as our firstborn granddaughter Alice. And in 1909, David Winslow, whom we called Winslow and Babe about equally often. The community here managed pretty well, a lot than some places in the state or even in the county. Plymouth, the county seat, was what they called a sundown town. And for those of you who don't know what sundown towns are, they're towns where black folks couldn't stay overnight. The local paper, The Citizen, had a news item every week from each of the little burgs in the area. All the social events that had taken place in Burr Oak and in Hibbard and in Rutland and so on, as well as one about Faculty Row from the Academy and one titled Colored Circles, which covered things like Entre Nous Club and reports back from children who had moved on in the world from our little village. Clara Rollins, Mr. George Rollins' daughter, graduated from Culver High School in 1906 and gave a senior speech about future relations between the races. She's the one that was killed in a house fire in 1909. His daughter Florence married Roy Watts in town, and his son Hollis became a dentist up in Detroit. My boy Palmer and his friend Charles Wesley Wade made a sort of local history when they joined the school's athletic teams in 1921-1922. They weren't the first black players on a team in the entire state. Southern Indiana was segregated, but Indianapolis wasn't. Until the Stevenson clan came along in the 1920s, so there have been several integrated teams in the state capital. But then, there just were not as many black youth living up here among the corn farms, so the boys were pioneers for this area. And Babe, of course, joined them once he was old enough. They were good athletes, all of them, and so they did basketball, baseball, track, pretty much everything available. Palmer and Winslow went both to play in college too. Palmer started off as a football player at Howard University in Washington, D.C., but then he quit and got married and went back to school in West Virginia, where he was Hall of Fame material and got his bachelor's degree in education. Winslow went to Heidelberg University in Ohio, where he played for Sue Sager. Coach Sager had grown up right here in Culver and played for the town and for the academy. He set a state record for basketball with 113 points in a game against Winnemac back in 1913. But that's not to say that Culver was putting up statues to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and Professor Carver. I mentioned Mr. Rollins a couple of times. Well, when he died in August of 1925, the Citizen had a front page about it with a photograph, and then had an obituary notice about him on the next to the last page. But on the very last page, right in the middle, there was an advertisement inviting people to attend a KKK meeting in Plymouth.
Oh, no.
Of course, you may say that was in Plymouth, but just for example, Culver, both school and the town had a long history of minstrel shows. In the 1920s, there were major civic events backed by the American Legion. Tickets were sold by the Boy Scouts, and big advertisements in the Culver Citizens sponsored by local businesses. And to be honest, people of both races took part in the show. Luther and I both sang in the 1912 Academy Waiters Minstrel, but if you look at those advertisements in the paper or from the bulletin from the performance, you can see that the Citizen had plenty of little engravings of racist cartoons, and they were not afraid to use them to liven up their pages. It made a difference too, if you were seen as being from town or not. One local druggist got royally chewed out by Lily Scott, whose daughter Thelma went to Howard with my son Palmer, when he excused himself from making some of her little cousins sit out on the sidewalk to eat their sundaes, by explaining that he didn't know that they were relatives of hers. A lot of our younger generation have moved away, and of course, with modern conveniences, the academy doesn't need quite as much help as it used to, either. Palmer was a teacher and coach at Paul Quinn College in Texas, which was the oldest black college west of the Mississippi, and earned an MA degree from Michigan. During the war, he worked for the USO and ended up living in California. I guess he wasn't too sure how that would work out, because he also got his undertaker's license and opened a mortuary. Just to have something to fall back on. Winslow and his wife are raising a family down in New Orleans. As for Zena and me, we did all right. We had a nice house on South Main Street. I was at the academy for 45 years until I hit mandatory retirement, the same as Roy Sheep Scott. After that, I took a vacation and then went right back to work at the State Exchange Bank and was there until the day I died. Thank you.
I want to thank Harold Clark for coming all the way down from Michigan, not just over the border, but several hours for that wonderful presentation.
Yes.
So thank you for being here. I do believe there are family members of Colonel Edward Payson in our midst. Would you stand, wave a hand? And so our next decedent, Colonel Edward Payson.
Thank you, Jeff. Remember when his grandmother was getting piano lessons in town? Ordinarily, if I'm standing up here and there are a bunch of people out there, I can expect that you have your instruments ready and your music open, but I'm just going to assume that you don't all have tubas under your chairs there. I was born out in Gloucester, Mass, and lived there long enough to know how to pronounce it. My parents moved to Indiana in 1911 as part of the great natural gas boom in central Indiana. And they lived in Alexandria, Indiana, and I have to tell you this, Alexandria was, besides a place for us to live, was also the first location for an electric interurban train in Indiana. So my interest in trains had a legitimate start early on down there in Alexandria. But in any case, my father got a job at the Quaker Fremont Academy, which is north of us, and gave music lessons, of course, there in Alexandria as well. And he directed the Fairmount Town Band as well. So we had a fairly stable environment. And I guess I fit right in. I was Dad's prime pupil, and he liked to show me off. I was a cornetist. I was a good enough cornetist, in fact, that I organized at the age of 10 the local Alexandria boys band, just so I would have other people to play with. But Father was so proud of being able to teach me all these different instruments that he would have me come down to the parlor when we had family guests and perform. So I would be up, studying or whatever, or out in the barn, and Dad would call and I would come in and I was supposed to play the clarinet, or whatever the instrument was at that time, often the clarinet. And I didn't think very kindly of that as a practice, really. So a couple of times he asked me to come in and play the clarinet, and I sat down, got out the instrument, softened up the reed, put it in, played the loudest, squawkiest noise I could manage. This may have something to do with my having gone to military school a couple of years later. When I was 15, my mother died, and my grandmother came out from Massachusetts to take care of us. Even then, I was interested in new instruments. I picked up the cello because I heard it played on phonograph records. There's a startling new thing still in 16, but there was a group that had organized to play just string quartet music. They didn't do anything else. They didn't take pupils. They just played and recorded string quartet music. When I heard their recordings and their cellist, I knew that was one instrument I wanted to add to my repertoire. So I finished at Alexandria, graduated, and in those days it was often the case that if you graduated from a small town school in the Midwest and wanted to go to college back east, you needed some finishing school. So my dad arranged for me to come to Culver Military Academy. As I said, there was that clarinet episode earlier on. And to be fair, he had kind of gotten interested in a young lady who lived next door. And it's not entirely, he didn't end up marrying her, but the fact that he was interested in someone so much younger than Mother had been may have been a little bit of an irritant too. Maybe just wanted to get me out of the way. But in any case, I came up here and I had a summer job with the Naval School Band as the Naval School Bugler. And then I went into my PG year in winter school where I was also the bugler. It was a nuisance being the bugle in winter school because to begin with, we played the bugle for everything. And in order to be heard, my post as a bugler was on the top floor of main barracks. So I have to climb up three stories and a half to get to the top floor and then play my bugle into a megaphone so I could be heard all over campus. It was a nuisance. In any case, I did my year at the academy and I went off to Harvard. So that was, looked like things were going to be fine. The first hint that something was not going to be fine was that the city of Fairmont stopped sending its students to Fairmont Academy, the Quaker school where Dad worked. The deal had been that rather than having a public high school, they would just send all their kids there, and that helped the Quakers stay open. Everybody was satisfied. When the town stopped sending people there, that was a major hit to the Quaker budget, as you can imagine, by not having students coming there anymore, and that had repercussions down the line. Because I finished my first 2 years at Harvard, and in 23, Fairmont Academy closed. So Father was left without his most permanent part of the job, and he eventually moved to California looking for a new place to work, and then from there up to Oregon. So there wasn't the family money that there had been to go to Harvard, and at the same time, maybe I was a little bit rebellious, I hate to say it. So I left Harvard before I finished my senior year, kind of bummed around, got some work here and there, and the spring after I would have graduated, so in 1926, it turned out they needed somebody to be the assistant band director and the TAC officer, teach the kids how to march at the Summer Naval School. I knew how to do that. I applied. Colonel Callahan was glad to have me as an aide, and I came back to Culver in the summer of 26. And it wasn't too long before the colonel decided he wouldn't mind having some help for winter school as well. So I had a contract to work through the winter and potentially be a regular faculty member with all those people who I just had as my teachers 4 years before. Well, that summer, I had taken to the movies a young lady named Billy. Her actual name was Wilma, but Billy Eisenhard. And the Eisenhards lived just down the street and around the corner from the movie theater. So after the show, Billy said, why don't you come back to the house? Of course, you know, Dad and Mom and you can meet my family. So we went back to their house. It's kind of there on Madison. It's just a block west of the hardware store. Went back to the house, and it became obvious that Billy had an ulterior motive in mind, because she said, here, Ed, why don't you meet my older sister, Dottie? She plays the piano. You play the cello. You could play duets together. Well, and we did play duets together, to be fair. Captain Eisenhard, Colonel Eisenhard, eventually, he was the first science instructor at the Academy, and he was the man responsible for WCMA, the Academy radio station. So Dottie and I, and nearly everybody else they could get, had to come in and play music and do recitations in order to have material for WCMA. So we did play together, but also in January I proposed and we were engaged. And in fact, we were married that June. We were married in the Genelets living room in the old Swiss-style superintendent's home, 300 guests, a big party there, then a reception at the Eisenhards, and then we all went back and danced at the Genelets till the wee small hours of the morning. And she really was, she was the center of my life. I remember, I was always reminded of Mrs. Browning's poem, you know, the one that starts, how do I love thee, let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach. I love you with my childhood's faith. I love thee with the love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. She was a wonderful mother to our daughter Martha. She was a wonderful accompanist for duets throughout our life. She was a wonderful cook, and I have inserted in your programs a recipe for lemon cookies, by the way. So go home and try them. Lemon whippersnappers there in her own handwriting. So I stayed at the Academy. I was always busy. I was taking cello lessons, and when the string instructor up in South Bend decided to organize a South Bend symphony, I was part of that from the very beginning. It wasn't much of a symphony when we started. We had to pay to belong to the symphony in order to get music. And you had to sell tickets to your friends as well. But then there was this lady named Ella Morris, whose husband ran the bank up in South Bend. And when Mrs. Morris took over the symphony, then she put it into a business-like condition, and pretty soon we were a professional organization. In 1936, of course, the Academy didn't need as much staff as it had, and they agreed to give me a 2-year leave to go off and complete my degree. Worcester, I suppose they say Worcester in Ohio, Worcester said that they would give me full credit for my time at Harvard, so I only needed 1 year. I ended up staying there for 2 because I worked my way through I was a student, but I was also the band director and the concert band director because I kind of had experience by that time. So I played my way through. I got my degree. I got cello lessons, not at Worcester, but at Oberlin, because Worcester didn't have anybody who played the cello. Came back to Culver in June of '38 and stayed here for the rest of my life. And I did one or two things that kind of made, I guess, an impact on town. These were the days when you just needed a band to do anything. There's a story about Queen Elizabeth that when they made the first English transistor radio, of course, they gave her one. And so she went in to see her mother, the Queen Mom, and she had this little box, and she showed it to her mother and explained it, and her mother said, well, Lilibet, I don't understand. Why do you need this? And she said, well, it's so much more convenient than a wireless. I can have music wherever I go. And her mother said, Lilibet, you have bands for that. And that was the way it was at the Academy. They had the band for everything. We said, the band does everything everybody else does, plus music. So I spent a lot of time composing music, writing marches, rearranging things that Colonel Callahan had arranged originally. I rearranged Ye Men of Culver once we built the chapel and had an organ to play for it. But the thing that people, I think, remember was in the summer of 1943. So in 42, the town fathers had asked me if maybe the Academy Naval School Band would be interested in playing again in the park as they had some years in the past. Well, of course, this was just right back to where my father had been at Fairmont all those years ago, playing band concerts in the park. I said, sure, we can do that with our eyes closed. So we did it in 42. In the summer of 43, they said, well, Ed, you want to do it again? I said, sure. So we had a concert lined up, and to give you an idea of what we did for a concert, we played we played a concert at the Academy every Sunday evening as well, plus playing for chapel and all the other stuff. But the concert we played on Thursday night in 1943, in August, included 2 marches. I have the list here. There were 12 pieces altogether, 2 marches, a piece from Porgy and Bess, 2 light classical pieces, a waltz, 3 novelty pieces, Latin American fantasy, Anchors Aweigh, and of course the Star Spangled Banner. So you would have thought that might have been enough, but I had a trick up my sleeve because Bud Kraft, who worked for the Academy 2 years before, had made for the Academy a square-rigged ship. And I said, Bud, I bet I could put the band on that ship. And so after playing a concert for 2,000 people on Thursday night in the park, we loaded the band onto the O.W. Fowler and started sailing around playing a Moonlight Serenade. And people have kept it up since then, I believe. I have to tell you that first year we just barely got it in. There were thunderstorms all night on Sunday, and we just got in between 2 thunderstorms to play the first Moonlight Serenade. And then, of course, the other thing that people might remember is that starting in the 1930s, I was interested in model railroading. This was between there was the period where I was taking photographs. Well, anyway, one of my hobbies, but I was interested in model railroading. So we built a model railroad in the bottom of the Academy Memorial Building, and it became very popular. It became so popular that when they wanted to redo the basement of the Memorial Building, and they were going to put the history department down there, they said, Ed, you got to move your railroad. Where are you going to put it? And I said, well, what if I put it in the basement of the dining hall? And they said, there isn't really a space there. I said, maybe I could wall off a space. They said, where are you going to get the money at? It isn't in the budget to wall off part of the basement. I said, Mr. Culver owns stock in the Frisco Railroad. So maybe if I approach Mr. Culver about giving us some money to put up a wall, I could build a model railroad in the back, and I would just always have a train from the Frisco ready to run in case Mr. Culver came to visit. So we built a railroad back there, and it became nationally famous. Model Roader magazine ran a coverage on it. And then, of course, when they wanted to redo the basement of the dining hall, there wasn't any place to put it anymore. But I suspect the model railroad is gone, but I think the Moonlight Serenade is going to live on. Thank you all very much.
I'm going to go off script and tell you one of my favorite stories. And he kept saying no. And so when the band cadets approached her and said, what do you think your father would like for his birthday? She said, I think he'd like a poodle. So the band gathered, and he's on center stage up front, and they say, sir, happy birthday. They give him his poodle. And he had to smile. All right. That does conclude our program. I think we have an opportunity for presenters to ask to be asked questions, I should say, by the audience, bearing in mind they may have forgotten aspects of their lives when they lived many, many decades ago. They've been dead for so long. Does anyone have any questions? No. Anyone? Last chance. Okay. Well, thank you again for coming. As I said earlier, our volunteers are prepared to guide you to the graves of the folks who we have presented today. So if you're interested in that, not sure exactly who's doing that here, but unfortunately I have to run, so I won't be able to do it. But okay, so who's guiding?
I think they could talk about refreshments.
Oh, refreshments. Thank you. Yes. We have a lot of refreshments that we need you to eat and all that and drink. So please do over at the tent. Again, thank you so much to all our volunteers, everyone involved behind the scenes and in front. And have a wonderful day. Thank you all for coming.